applying an extra level of caution onto your suggestions, Tennant. I think this is by far the nerdiest of the papers that we've looked at so far.
Oh, it is. It totally is, yes.
Like, I'm here for it, but I was like, oh man, I'm having to, like, dig out from the annals of my mind all of the Greek alphabet.
Yep.
in the
formulas
in the
that matter.
Equations and stuff. I know. Oh, Euler's equation. It's bringing it all back for me. Anywho, sorry. We can crack on.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, the magnificent Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening. Although, sadly, I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, so we're no longer in the same postcode.
That is true. We'll have to bring the enthusiasm and energy that we brought to our in-person episode last week to this virtual recording.
By talking over the top of you.
No. Behave yourself.
Yes, that's exactly what we'll do.
Yes, that's exactly what we should do.
And that dulcet tone that just broke in over me was the best-dressed man in Australian climate advocacy, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Well, I don't know if I'm that well-dressed right now. I'm underneath a blanket once again for echo suppression reasons.
We do have cause to be in the same room as each other later on this week, Tennant, so I'm very hopeful that you'll be breaking out the three-piece suit, as is your wont.
I can promise I will not be wearing a blanket.
On this week's show, we look at a recent epic takedown of integrated assessment models, the standard mode of economic analysis employed to assess the optimal response to climate change. But before we get into that, we've had some big news out of the US with the Inflation Reduction Act passing the Senate.
And the House.
And the House.
It's passed. It's like it just needs Joe Biden's signature.
Yes, they're no doubt assembling a cavalcade of luminaries to cluster around him and collect the various pens that generally emerge from these signing ceremonies in the US. What's the process is that he signs a little bit of his signature with different pens so that various people can claim to have the pen. And this is quite a significant bill, so I suggest those pens will be in some demand.
Sounds like pen inflation to me.
Half a letter at a time by the looks of it.
So anyway, something of a grand bargain encompassing healthcare, tax reform and climate spending. But the climate investments were pretty significant in the order of $370 billion US, right, Frankie?
Enormous amounts of money. And also I think the bill sort of aims to bring in, I think it's over $300 billion in new revenue as well over the next little while by imposing, I think it's a 15% minimum tax on corporations that make over $1 billion in revenue, as well as a new excise tax on corporate stock buybacks. But there's significant climate commitments in this, as well as healthcare. And we know what sorry to any US listeners we might have over there, what a basket case the US health care
I think they know
is.
how much of a basket case it is.
Well, we would hope that we have reasonable listeners on this podcast, and I think one could reasonably call the US healthcare system a basket case. So just a really quick note on those things. They're extending a range of subsidies that have helped and will continue to help with keeping premiums down. They were meant to expire next year, and they're also putting in a cap on out-of-pocket expenses for prescription drugs. But obviously, the bigger proportion of focus has been on the climate commitments, which are significant.
Yeah, very significant.
Colossal.
So there's a whole bunch of stuff to accelerate the roll out of renewables, subsidies, investments in transmission infrastructure. I, as is my wont, did the search for energy efficiency, and there's some reasonably significant programs on that front. There's $9 billion on consumer home energy rebate programs. There's tax credits effectively for electrification, heat pumps and electric HVAC and water heaters. The idea is to make them as affordable as possible. And then there's a specific $1 billion grant program to make affordable housing more energy efficient. So that whole weatherisation agenda, which was a pretty central part of the Biden election campaign, is starting to find some kind of form and funding through the Inflation Reduction Act, Senate.
Yeah, and there's money for a lot of things. The tax credits that have been the main US federal support for renewable energy have been extended, and in fact, they've been made permanent, but they're also now technology neutral. So nuclear energy is eligible within some definitions of what counts as acceptable. CCS is eligible. There's money in there for hydrogen. There's a lot of stuff, and it's also going to make a difference to the industrial scene because there's while there are substantial supports for EV take-up, the conditions on those supports will gradually phase in to discourage EV componentry coming from China and encourage more content coming from North America. There's also, this thing is gigantic. It's so gigantic, things can get lost in it. There is a carbon tax in there. It's a carbon tax on fugitive methane emissions from oil and gas infrastructure, and it's pretty big. It reaches $50 a ton by 2026. That's coupled with financial help for the oil and gas sector to do methane detection and leak reduction. But yeah, it's pretty big. Although, how we should think about it compared to what was once promised or what recently seemed like it might be possible, which was nothing. It's been a real roller coaster, but
it's been a massive roller coaster.
People have gotten off alive.
Well, I mean, 2 weeks ago, Joe Manchin was persona non grata with much of the Democratic caucus and many sort of environmental activists having, basically doomed the planet to a fiery doom, and now he's the saviour of the climate, apparently, Tennant. How do we think this is going to play out politically?
I think there's a lot of climate people gritting their teeth and smiling fixedly about Joe Manchin today. This is the crucial 50th vote in the Senate. A moderate Democrat from a state that voted for Trump by 26 points or something in the 2020 election. So remarkable he's there at all. He doesn't see eye to eye with the left flank of the Democrats, and he insisted on a whole bunch of things. So there's stuff in this bill that eases permitting of new oil and gas, and in fact, there's a if this then that requirement around some permitting for solar and wind can only take place if a minimum amount of permitting of lands for oil and gas has been offered. So there's a bunch of things to make Joe Manchin a bit happier about things. But it's a pretty big deal. It's a hugely consequential piece of legislation.
The thing that's really important to note for those listeners that don't follow the blow-by-blow of US politics is the window to do anything was closing because of the impending midterms. There is a strong expectation that the Democrats at minimum will lose control of the Senate. There's very likely to lose control of the House as well. And in that context, any action on the climate agenda would have been nigh on impossible, given the relative priorities of the Republicans versus the Democrats and the inclination to not give the president a win, which in the polarised US political system is an overarching agenda regardless of the views of particular members of the House or indeed senators. Is there anything else we want to say about US stuff?
Well, just one thing, which is if people want to know what this great big bill will do, they might be tempted to ask an economist to crank up an integrated assessment model to tell them. But would that be a good idea?
That would be a terrible idea. And let's unpack why that is.
I think it's time to unpack a report. What do you reckon?
I'm psyched.
I've got the equations ready to go.
Integrated assessment models have long been the standard tool of economists studying the optimal response to climate change, a method of balancing current costs of climate action with long-term benefits. IEMs are deeply embedded in the global climate architecture, most notably the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports on adaptation and mitigation. However, IAMs are not without their detractors, with the latest assault recently launched from the climate economist super team Nicholas Stern, Joseph Stiglitz and Charlotte Taylor. So, Tennant, what are integrated assessment models and why are Stern, Stiglitz and Taylor so intent on taking them down?
So, when we're looking at climate change and policy to combat climate change, it's really useful to be able to bring together the economy and the environment and the effects that they have on each other. What will climate mitigation do to the economy? What will the impacts of climate change do to the economy? How much will growth of the economy and changes in its composition affect emissions? These are important questions. And in 2018, Bill Nordhaus, a unthinkably eminent economist, won the Nobel Prize for Economics for his work many years before in developing what became the integrated assessment model, which does this integration. It brings together these two pieces. And they have got, since he invented them, they have got more complex, they've got more involved, they've responded to some of the criticisms made by various bells and whistles being added on, but they're still a construct that takes, and we're going to get into some really economistic language here. This is, I think, so far, maybe the nerdiest paper that we've done. It has equations galore and it means them. They matter, even though they're mostly saying the results of the equations are not very good and the equations themselves are maybe missing the point.
I think the real intended title of this paper is the Nordhaus Takedown.
Yes. With respect.
With respect. We violently disagree.
And you've ruined the world.
Yeah.
If we characterise Nicholas Stern, Joseph Stiglitz and Charlotte Taylor as the Avengers super team of the climate economist world, I think they're trying to put Nordhaus in the role of Thanos.
I think so.
I mean, it's unkind, but probably a realistic assessment of how they're trying to malign some of his work. That said, and I think probably what it's important to preface all this conversation with, though, and indeed even these Avengers acknowledge that at the outset, that it was very reasonable at the time for economists to use the tools in the toolbox that they had to start thinking about the challenge of climate change. And I think what these guys do really well, I think, is articulate over and over again that like the standard workhorse is no longer appropriate in many contexts, and that there's a fundamental problem with this is that this kind of model is just not well suited to analysing problems where you have deep uncertainty and extreme risk.
Yes.
And also I think very importantly that concept of intergenerational equity, where you're making decisions today that impact people that aren't here yet to voice their opinions on the matter.
They open strongly in making this case, making the point that, according to the high priests of integrated assessment models, social optimisation entails accepting a temperature increase of 3.5 to 4 degrees Celsius, a level of climate change which would result in not having much society left. Does make a lot of sense. It's a little bit crazy, and then they spend the rest of the paper unpacking how a whole bunch of very well-meaning economists could have come up with a methodology that produces results which are fundamentally out of line with the global consensus about the level of risk appetite we're prepared to accept.
The Paris Agreement embodies a choice of goals that is not what's dictated by these or suggested by these models.
Indeed.
So I think I should say the integrated assessment models, the IAMs, try to work out what's the expected value of burdens today for reducing emissions versus benefits in the future or avoided costs in the future from reducing climate change, to find the pathway that maximises net present value and optimise towards that. And they tend to generate some worries about the accelerating costs of excessively hasty mitigation, and they encourage us to pick how much mitigation we should do based on this calculation of costs and benefits. And it doesn't work very well. Is the gist of it. And as Frankie was saying, they outline a bunch of, the authors of this paper outline a bunch of problems, and they say some of these problems are tractable with a lot more work, although they produce models that look very different and maybe still aren't that useful to actually inform a decision. But then some of the problems are just not addressable at all within this whole analytical framework. And those are the problems of deep uncertainty and extreme risk. And the foundational ethical questions involved in that treatment of future generations versus present generations, where even the improved solutions or approaches, these authors don't find very satisfactory.
Shall we dive into that? Because it seems like that uncertainty and risk and the inability of IAMs to kind of grapple with that is kind of like at the heart of this paper. It's kind of like it fundamentally breaks this standard economic model.
Yeah, so the IAMs require there are formulae underlying this. Like, these are extremely mathematical models, and you need to specify a bunch of terms in these equations, and those include things like the damages function, which is going to tell you what the value is of all the things that will happen if climate goes up by 0.5 degree or 1 degree or 10 degrees, if average surface temperatures rise by that level. And a problem with this is that we have some significant uncertainties. We don't know. We know that we don't know everything that will happen at extreme temperature rise levels. The potential for catastrophic outcomes, for state changes in the whole climate system or in particular regions. There's a lot of uncertainty around these things, and for the most part, they are not in any way incorporated into integrated assessment models. There are just these smooth damages functions where things get just incrementally worse in a very predictable way. The authors make the point that the past data that we have on economic impacts of climatic changes, from things like they don't mention this one, but a bit of cooling following the eruption of Mount Pinatubo and some interference with agricultural production, like those things don't just scale smoothly to predictive knowledge about economic impacts in the future. IAMs just kind of ignore a lot of this stuff, and they go with, well, what's in a format that we can easily plug into these formulae? And then when you get to the risk part of it, we have some fairly extreme risks. And they talk about fat-tailed risks, where you have a significant probability of quite different things happening, rather than like a central cluster of probabilities and these little unlikely extremes out to the end. Like, my analogy for that would be, suppose I offered you a pill and you knew there was a 50% chance the pill was poison and would kill you immediately, but there was also a 50% chance that it was the Philosopher's Stone and would grant you eternal life. the expected value of that pill is that nothing happens to you. But that's not either of the possibilities for what will actually happen to you. So if you just plug that into your integrated assessment model for should you swallow random pills given to you by weirdos, it's going to say, doesn't really matter. There's a really bad fit between the stuff that is easy to put into this sort of mathematical model and the realities of climate change as we understand them and the limitations of our understanding.
I want to go back to the piece around risk and start to talk about what some of the kind of underlying assumptions in the way that IAMs work that kind of are relevant here. So the one that sort of I think really important to point out is that it only assumes a market failure in response, like one market failure in response to one externality being increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And like the world just doesn't work like that.
Yeah. And the failure is that those emissions are not priced.
Yep. Exactly. And so it doesn't account for like the complexity of the real world when we know that there are even from impacts of climate change that we're already seeing in the real world today. You see multiple market failures that require a response from governments that carbon pricing, as IAMs posit, are not going to help with.
It goes to one of the key insights of the paper, which is that they're positing that the folk that have come up with IAMs kind of have an intellectual bias towards assuming that the carbon pricing is a panacea.
Yes.
That an appropriate level of carbon pricing will solve all issues. It's like if some 1950s economist wearing horn-rimmed glasses and pocket protectors, if you locked them all in a room and they came up with the optimal carbon price, we could all go home and the job's done. But that is absolutely not the case, because you've got all these sectors of the economy and subsectors which have really complex, tricky issues. The rate of change that we need to see in each of those subsectors is such that we need to move at a rapid rate of knots to get where we need to be to avoid catastrophic climate change. There's investment in R&D. There's a lack of transparency in terms of carbon risk and, just the carbon intensity of product stuff that we've talked about before. And that requires really detailed, granular policy making, governments working closely with industry to rapidly transition. The fundamental premise around which some of these economic subsectors are based. And you're just not going to get there with carbon pricing.
Certainly not carbon pricing alone.
That's it. So, and they make that point. They're just saying it's not that we shouldn't have carbon pricing. It's just that the idea that one can rely on carbon pricing to drive the change at the scale and the speed that we need. I was sort of reflecting on this. I don't think they make this exact point, but if we had a couple hundred years or whatever, like a long time, I think you could argue that you price carbon and you could see that longer term transition. But when we've got the order of 2 or 3 decades to drive this transformation, it just seems implausible.
I think the point they make really well is that in the presence of like deep uncertainty, this idea of a if X then Y, and as sort of Tennant said, using a kind of very predictable and sort of, linear in a way focus on damages and how that's incorporated into a model, that doesn't reflect the real world experience of like rational people who, when faced with deep uncertainty, tend to act in a more risk-averse, precautionary way, which would suggest that stronger action on climate is required and is a reasonable kind of assumption to feed into these kinds of models.
So we should probably talk a little bit about the critique they have of the sensitivity of these models, because they have a bunch of criticisms of how unrealistic the bog standard IAMs have been in their treatment of a bunch of important issues, including the nature of structural changes in economies, flaws in particular markets, or just the limits in the way that markets work, technological innovation and distributional effects. But they say for a lot of these things, and like the weaknesses in the damages functions, you can improve them. People have been trying, economists of goodwill have been trying to improve these things, and the models then spit out numbers for how much emissions reduction you should do or what kind of carbon prices you need that are much more similar to those arrived at by different means, like this guardrail ethos of avoiding catastrophic risk. But they say, actually, the wild changes in the carbon prices and the optimal warming that are spat out by the models when you change the assumptions in that way highlight that the models aren't that useful to actually guide policy because they're extremely sensitive to the input assumptions, and the more detailed and micro you get in those to try to map as well as possible to your current understanding of the world, the more likely they are to flip all over the place. So, as is, not unknown in the relationship between economic modelling and policy making, you find yourself getting out pretty much what you put in, and if rather than this being an oracle that will tell us what we ought to do, it becomes at best a way of just thinking through what we already know in a more abstract way, and at worst, an exercise in propaganda in whatever direction, depending on what assumptions you're putting in.
To the whatever direction point, I wrote this down because I thought it was good to put some numbers to the ranges in values that they were talking about. They quoted a meta-analysis by another in another paper that found, so these modified IAMs where you're making efforts to be more sensitive to some of those input areas, or I guess more accurate to real world sort of outcomes. There was a range anywhere from, I think it was minus $14-ish a ton up to $2,400 a ton. So, choose your own adventure from within that range. And they also said that they didn't see value or suggest that you should do a meta-analysis to get a central value from those studies. So they're like, it's no good sort of looking at all those things and then, effectively trying to take an average or something like that would get you to a reasonable kind of credible price by considering all the analyses done, because they say a lot of the studies that are available in literature don't take into account the latest developments in climate science. So
they just have missing pieces compared to other ones.
Yeah, and that they would, and then you would need to weight different studies differently based on how, comprehensive they were or not. So basically that's a waste of time.
And so I've got an anecdote on this that may illustrate why this is not just some nerd fest epic rap battle.
Why should we care, Tennant? Why should we care?
Okay, so this stuff really matters, and I heard a talk at the Paris Climate Summit from a guy from the American, it was the Edison Electric Institute, so the peak body for the power sector, and they had gone through the process. They'd done a reverse engineering of the process by which the Obama administration came up with a single US government-wide social cost of carbon estimate that was going to be the number that got plugged into all regulatory analysis of whether the EPA or the Department of Energy or whoever should do or not do something to address emissions. So the US regulatory analysis, it's required in their system for valid lawmaking, or rulemaking rather. And there'd been for a while, there had been no number. in the Bush administration, and then there'd been a bunch of numbers, and this task force came together to prepare one number, and then these people went through its entrails afterwards to work out what they'd done. And they had not done a meta-analysis of all of the social costs of carbons out there. They had picked 3, a big one and a medium one and a low one.
Oh my God, that's horrifying.
And they did an arithmetic average of the carbon price numbers that they spat out, and they said, that's the number for the US. And like the low one that said, so carbon's not, it doesn't matter that much. It had like input assumptions on science that were decades out of date. It didn't have entire pieces of the economy that other ones had. It was just like, it was not comparing apples and oranges. It was like doing an arithmetic average of an orange and a picture of an apple and of a mandarin-shaped eraser. And there was a guy in the audience for this talk, and he stuck his hand up and came up to the stage, and he had been the climate advisor to Obama during this period. And he said that he learnt things in this talk that he didn't know in that process. But he said, and like this is important, he said, yes, it's like a highly imperfect number, but the system, like the regulatory system requires a number, and some number beats no number. And no number was what there had been, no value whatsoever on the social cost of carbon just a few years before. So, and then, of course, just a few years after that, Trump administration came in and they rewrote the process, and they said, an extremely high discount rate is needed here. We can talk about them some more. And therefore, the social cost of carbon comes down by like 90%.
That's horrifying.
I think they do call out the US as a country in which IAMs are having a particularly deleterious effect on policy making, that they're overemphasised relative to other jurisdictions. So I think that's an interesting jumping off point to think about some of the arena in which the authors say the world has gone in another direction, regardless of IAMs, and you referenced earlier the Paris Agreement tenant as a place in which a different set of concerns and analysis have arrived at a position which is much more based around risk avoidance and an understanding of collective responsibility to avoid some of the more catastrophic scenarios around climate change. One could say that's almost in spite of the proliferation of IEMs.
Yes.
And yet, there's a suggestion that while that's the high-level ambition, that they're still having a corrosive effect on policy making almost at the national and subnational level by suggesting activity and actions which are not as ambitious as they might otherwise be if IAMs weren't sort of as popular as they are in terms of a lens for thinking about policy making. And there's a suggestion that an approach that had a more granular understanding of the various market failures that exist in various subsectors of the economy and was taking an appropriate approach to dealing with some of those market failures might actually find that the price of mitigation is actually much lower than is commonly understood, because relatively low cost public investments could have transformational effects.
There are multiple areas within these IAMs that I think underestimate our ability to change. Yep. And so, like, the technology piece is one of them. Like, preference changes and demographics isn't, like, they're like huge cans of worms in and of themselves. And so the authors make the point that just for one kind of, little insight, we should think about the fact that there is an increasing fraction of the population that cares about the environment and its preservation. So not even taking that into account and then thinking about how that extrapolates over time, as presumably the more exposed you are to the negative impacts of climate change, the more you care about doing something as well. Like, none of that is factored in to these models, so they're flawed at the outset. Hey, can we talk about discounting?
Yes. Can we stop talking about discounting will be the real question. But start.
Unlikely. I think the premise on which IAMs are based is that you assume that people are living forever. Like,
one person, in fact.
One person is living forever.
And they are maximising their utility over time.
Such that when you start to think about how that overlays in the real world, where you don't have one person alive forever that's, able to stick around and, potentially see the fruits of their labour or vice versa, the impact of this generation's decisions or next generation decisions when you apply discounting factors and you effectively weighting down the impacts of your decisions that you make today and the impacts of those are massively ethically questionable.
Yes.
Because you're effectively weighting down the importance, the experience of people who are not alive yet to speak for themselves, and there's a massive ethical dilemma embedded into these very models through the act of discounting, at all.
There was a bunch of great lines in this report, but one that stood out to me was when they were talking about attaching a lower weight to a future life because it occurs, in 2050 or 2100 or whatever is discrimination by date of birth. This is where, trying to apply an economist's approach to these sorts of, as you say, Frankie, moral and ethical questions about how we approach these issues, it just breaks down. And it is, once one is engaging with the magnitude of what we're dealing with when it comes to the climate crisis, we're talking about the Wizard of Oz. It's the Tin Man, right? But not having the heart to actually understand that sort of approach to discounting is fundamentally incompatible with a just approach to the transition they're working through.
The other thing is they do keep coming back to finding ways to say these models aren't fixable. So on the question of discounting, they say both in terms of the pure time preference issue, is a life in 50 years worth more or less than a life today? They say, well, the only ethically justifiable discount rate there or rate of time preference is zero, that you have no difference in your preference for a person to be alive tomorrow versus today. But they also say if you try then to put a zero discount rate into these models, they don't work because you've got an infinite value, like anything you do that just continues to improve people's lives into the future has an infinite value. And the equations break down when you introduce infinities to them. Positive ones from helping an infinite or effectively infinite series of people, but negative ones from risks of human extinction or at least the collapse of the economy that is being modelled. Neither of those things fit into these equations well, but they're quite important things for actual people to think about if they're willing to think about them explicitly and not just be like a passive consumer of the number from behind the curtain. So
they're proposing an alternative approach, and they characterise it broadly as the guardrails approach, which is, mindful of the risk of catastrophic climate change and the great uncertainty surrounding it, and basing one's approach on the preference to effectively manage those risks, and then do the analysis sitting under that would allow you to do that in an efficient and effective way, right? And I thought it was interesting that they didn't necessarily propose an alternative approach. They suggested that we needed a diversity of approaches that we could bring to bear on all of these analytical issues, compare and contrast different insights so that we can unpack all the questions that are associated with transition in different parts of the economy.
They have the call to look at sectoral models that look at more detailed structures and policies within parts of the economy rather than just at this aggregate level where you've got, a handful of specified values. I think it's important for us, though, to keep in mind that all of those models will have flaws too, and they'll be critiquable. The improved IAMs will be critiquable, and use of them in the even the more limited way that is envisaged here will be critiquable. Aggregate stuff does have its place, and for instance, I get a bit uneasy when people are using sector models to say a clean energy transition creates all these jobs in whatever, whether upgrading houses or building renewable energy or whatever, that little narrow model will spit out a number of people that are needed or person hours that are needed to get the things done. And we've been talking about integrated assessment models, not computable general equilibrium models, which are the things that spit out the big numbers for Australian economic arguments quite often. Those models CGE models have all kinds of problems, including some very similar ones to the IAMs. But the thing that makes them annoying, which is that they produce an equilibrium where everything works out to be quite a small impact in the end, is also an important reminder, though, that resources do come from somewhere, people do come from somewhere. If you are boosting demand in one sector of the economy for labour, you may be drawing labour away from other pieces of the economy. You should be cautious about thinking that a narrow view tells you everything you need to know. But we should be very cautious about thinking that these IAMs tell us everything we need to know, and we haven't had enough of that caution.
So I kind of want to take us back to your anecdote earlier where the bloke who was Obama's climate advisor, or the consensus at that summit was better to have a number than no number, is then the conclusion of this, better to have IAMs that can generate a number that informs a carbon tax because you need that alongside a range of other interventions than have nothing at all? I don't know. Maybe that's where this is landing.
I want to caution listeners who may be thinking, boy, these IAMs sound pretty bad. These things are used by people to say, we don't need to do much about climate change. The model said so. You, dear listener, you may be yourself a deployer of questionable numbers from IAMs, because if you...
We're all complicit.
That's right. The enemy was inside us all along. Because quite a lot of people have done some version of saying this policy from the Australian government or the US government or whoever is deplorably weak and not equal to what we need. The former carbon price was too low or whatever else because it doesn't match the carbon price path that the IPCC says is needed to achieve net zero or 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. But that price path, and for instance, the Climate Change Authority in its 2014 big review of what emissions targets for Australia should be, they used the integrated assessment model outputs of the necessary carbon price paths. Those price paths that we're saying policies aren't good compared to are spat out by models that say it's not worth doing anything. And if you force them to do something, they spit out very high costs for doing it because they assume, for all the reasons we've said, that your starting point is a perfectly efficient global economy other than the carbon constraint, and you've got to distort it to do all these inefficient, expensive, hard things in order to achieve the outcome. And if you don't think those models are well-based, then to your point earlier, Luke, maybe it's possible to achieve a lot more than you think with a more modest cost, and including a modest carbon price, whether it's an explicit one or an implicit one in policies that don't do that explicitly, whether they're regulatory or subsidies for this and that. So I think we should have some caution and humility like all over the shop, because these have been really widely used, influential tools, even though they're kind of garbage.
Well, I guess what I would say is that one should always approach modelling with caution, because the assumptions are always going to drive the outcomes, and obviously you can have really bad models and you can have models that are much more robust, but nevertheless a different team on a different day is going to come up with a different number ultimately. The only worse alternative is to have no models, and therefore no framework for which to sort of start to think about the various inputs and to reflect on the various trade-offs. The thing that troubles me about models in the way that we deploy them in climate and energy debates is they're treated as holy writ. Yes. Rather than...
Or satanic influences that are just...
Either way, we bring this religiosity to our discussion of models, rather than understanding what they are, which is like an intellectual framework in which we can think about some of the various trade-offs that we have as we pursue a chosen goal. Because it's up to us as human beings and as societies to decide what do we want to achieve, and we want to do that in an efficient way, obviously, but we're never going to have all the information we need, but we have enough information to define what our task is. Our task is to avoid catastrophic climate change. So use the models, but don't, bow down before them. And that's what I liked about this paper, is it is encouraging us to bring a healthy scepticism to the models, to not abandon modelling exercises altogether, but to understand that a diversity of perspective is going to give you the strongest possible basis on which to make good decisions, and I think that's a good place to be.
And I think we should end on the optimistic note that the authors did on this paper, which was that and we've spent this podcast talking about the deficiencies of those models, but they themselves sort of say that in focusing on some of the failures that these models don't tend to account for properly, they're putting attention on the fact that there's an upside potential in the way that the real world operates, which is, that there's the possibility of like a new sort of cleaner, greener model for growth into the future where, people are positively incentivized and inclined to act, and that cost of action could in fact be negative. And so there's that sort of success piece on innovation that we reflected on around the growth curves on renewables, and how the real world experience of that has been like so much better than what these models have taken into account, and that should give us all cause for hope.
Maybe we should return to this one in 150 years and see how we've done. Seeing if we can find an infinitely lived individual to do that check-in for us.
We need to put this podcast into a time capsule. Someone to dig up and go, aha, they were right. Or, well, let's not talk about the or.
We're assuming this scenario, there's someone to dig up the time capsule.
Yes, exactly. That's why I wasn't actually going to be explicit and say that, but you've gone ahead and done it. That's fine. We're going to be right, so don't worry about it.
We just need to put Michigan J Bullfrog into the vault with the recording of this episode, and it'll all be fine. I'm not going to do a rendition of Ragtime Gal, however.
All right, it is time for one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie.
Luke, I think you should go first this week.
Okay, sure. Well, it's fair enough, because we had some sad news. It was announced last week that the Australian Energy Foundation, formerly Moreland Energy Foundation Limited, or MEFL as it was affectionately known, is shutting its doors after 22 years. It was founded back in 2000 with some of the money that was given to the Moreland Council as part of the privatisation of some of the energy assets that were owned by the council at the time, and it's played a really pivotal role over a couple of decades in supporting particularly households and vulnerable households, first in Moreland and then around Melbourne and more recently around the country, to adopt low emissions technologies, to electrify and to make their houses more thermally efficient, to improve lives in short. And they've had a strategy of expanding that impact over time to other geographic regions, both in Victoria and around Australia. They changed their name to the Australian Energy Foundation in 2019 and had big plans to expand their impact. But they're one of the organisations that really struggled both through COVID in the aftermath of COVID, and the board has taken the tough decision to shut up shop at the end of August. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the crew at the Australian Energy Foundation, and also for the many alumni of that organisation that are scattered around the energy and sustainability sector. There's even some of them at the Energy Efficiency Council where I work. It's an incredible legacy, both in terms of what they've achieved and the impact, but also not just the individuals that have been through that organisation and are continuing to kick goals. So it's a tough way to go out, but there's a lot to be proud of. So I just wanted everyone that has a connection with AEF to know that we're thinking of you.
Hear, hear. They're going to be the poorer for them not being around.
Yeah, it really sucks. All right, Frankie, you got something uplifting as a palate cleanser for that sad news?
I have the hope of something that's going to be uplifting. And whilst you may not be thinking along those lines when I say the words building ministers meeting, let me take you on a little journey. It's not very long. This is another ministerial forum that is actually not a creature of COAG or of National Cabinet. The Building Ministers meeting exists to provide direction to the Australian Building Codes Board, which is the sort of technocratic body responsible for writing the National Construction Code, which is the Building Code and the Plumbing Code. And for those of you who wonk out on buildings policy like me, you'll know that all governments are committed to a policy instrument called the Trajectory for Low Energy Buildings. And within that, there's a commitment to looking at increasing minimum energy performance standards of new buildings over time. And in 2019, we saw the first meaningful uplift to energy efficiency requirements for commercial buildings in a really long time. And when building ministers meet for the next time on the 26th of August, they're going to be deciding whether or not to approve increased energy efficiency performance requirements for residential buildings for the first time in over 12
years. It feels like.
Yeah, well, not far off. I mean, so, you know, the NCC only incorporated minimum requirements for energy efficiency in 2004, so we don't have a long track record of these things being in place. And since they're introduced, they're only really increased once at the national level, and they've been pretty dormant since 2009. So this is the first time they've been meaningfully increased since then, hopefully. So we're hopeful that when that ministerial communique comes out after the meeting, that they will have agreed to sign off on those changes, which will see a change in the thermal energy performance requirement from around a 6-star NatHERS equivalent to 7-star. And importantly, they're also introducing a sort of whole-of-home assessment approach to the use of energy throughout the home that combines a look at the different services. So very exciting. I know a lot of peers, including all of us here, have had an interest in that. So it would be great to see those changes get over the line.
Would not just be great, it is essential. Like, what are the two top order issues at a national level right now. Carbon and energy bills. And the idea that we could get to the end of this process and energy ministers would not sign off on a measure that will improve the situation on both of those fronts for new buildings moving forward would be completely insane.
It is hard to imagine a scenario in which, with cost of living pressures being what they are, they don't agree to adopt changes that have been at least 3 years in the making.
Maybe we should come back next episode and see what they did do.
I'll absolutely be wanting to talk about it regardless. I'm just putting down the marker.
All right. Well, there's something to look forward to. We'll reflect on that perhaps in our next episode. But Tennant, we've had a meeting of energy ministers just last Friday as we record. You wanted to reflect on that?
Yeah, and they agreed a lot of stuff. It was a very busy meeting. So I'm going to pick out just two pieces of that. We talked in our episode about the Integrated System Plan, about the possibilities that the ministers were going to expand this process. And Luke, you posed questions on Twitter to our listeners and followers. What would they want to see in a larger ISP?
And did they adopt our Twitterati recommendations?
Well, the Twitterati should be the judges. The communique reads in part that a new energy partnership on getting to net zero is going to develop detailed, integrated energy infrastructure and regional planning scenarios that span gas and electricity networks, electrification pathways, and new industry possibilities to identify jobs and investment pathways for renewed manufacturing and new industries like hydrogen. And then the second part is they have called for an assessment of the workforce, supply chain and community needs associated with the pipeline of transmission, renewable energy storage and industry development opportunities to inform domestic onshoring opportunities, investment needs, identify supply chain risks.
Are you just reading the communique, Tennant?
I am. It's gold. But also, my God, that's a lot of work. And not work that AEMO can do on their own.
Well, that's the trick, right? And this goes back to our conversation over the last couple of episodes. One of the most fascinating questions about this, and you can have an argument about scope. There's probably one or two things that aren't on that list that, from my perspective, probably should be there. I think there's going to be an opportunity for stakeholders to, I guess, engage with government in terms of what that final set of critical priority areas and how they interact, how that gets fleshed out. But who does the work and how that all gets collated up into some kind of coherent whole, super interesting, right?
An integrated assessment model, if you will.
But to bring it together, right, Frankie's just been talking about the Building Ministers Forum, and Tennant, you're saying, well, energy ministers are taking this broader view about the transition. The regulation that building ministers roll out around new buildings and building the trajectory more broadly has profound implications for energy system planning, and yet they're two parallel processes, silos. In most cases, they're not even the same ministers making those decisions. There's obviously some connective tissue between those two processes, but I'd argue that nowhere near enough. So there's a governance reform agenda associated with this. You can't just start locking more wonks in more rooms. It's actually about the decision-making process that gets driven out of that, right?
I don't know. We could try locking more wonks in more rooms.
Are we letting them out?
Well, I mean, we tend to lock ourselves in rooms together pretty frequently, and I do so enjoy that.
Well, I'm pro-locking wonks in rooms. That can't be the whole plan.
If we get wonks from many different domains and we put them in a literal escape room where they have to work together and unify their areas of expertise and synthesize them in order to get out.
Stern, Stiglitz, Taylor, are you taking notes? Well, I reckon that's a podcast.
That's a pod.
It's a lot of information. It's a lot of rumination.
Information, rumination, that's what we're bringing you, but it's all that we have time for today. We're on Twitter. Frankie is at Frankie Muscovich, Tennant is at Tennant Reid, and my handle is at Luke Menzel. You can also email us with your feedback or something you want us to cover on a future episode at mailbag@letmesumup.net. And can I say to the New South Wales public servant that did email us, was our first emailee. I did reply, but the New South Wales government spam filter doesn't like letmesumup.net, and so I suspect you may not have got the email reply, so I'm telling you here. Probably not the most efficient way of saying that I'm not ignoring your email, but...
That's deeply asynchronous communication.
Never miss an episode by subscribing to Let Me Sum Up in your favourite podcast app, and you'll find all of our episodes at letmesumup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.